reliable trading routes. So does Canada. And Russia seeks new pipeline routes that bypass Ukraine to the north and the south. And to the north, it built Nord Stream with European partners directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea. And Russian and European partners like Shell and others are building, the French and Austrian and German and Dutch, are building a parallel line called Nord Stream 2. Now, Nord Stream 2 is a hot potato. It's 3/4 built. It should be built by the end of the year. And Central Europe wants it, the Germans and the Dutch and the Austrians and the Czechs. And the Ukraine and Britain and Poland and the Baltic states oppose it. And this is a big thing. It's just very little in our paper, maybe in the business section. And the United States is going all out to kill it. And the United States threatens sanctions on European participants. US senators framing a law to that effect, if it gets into law. Now, to the south, Russia is planning Turk Stream, or Turkish Stream, and 2 parallel lines, almost finished now, to bring gas under the Black Sea to Turkey. The first of these lines, the parallel, will bring gas to the Turkish market, particularly around Istanbul. And Turkey's a big place, and it's got a big user of gas. The second line would come landing into Turkey, would then head either towards Bulgaria or Greece, and that hasn't yet, they're sort of duking it out. And then the company called Nord Stream is leaving it to the Europeans to think how to bring the gas within their countries to market. They'll have to provide the pipelines existing or to be built. And these connecting pipelines within Europe require the approval of the European Commission, which is the Union Secretariat. And Brussels' approval is by no means certain, which is a kind of a euphemism that they don't like it. Brussels and Washington work hand in hand. They have a joint committee and they meet once a year. And they favor rival sources, US LNG, which I mentioned, Qatar, which I'll mention shortly, the Caspian Sea, which is Azerbaijan, which the British like because that's BP. And they welcome gas also recently found offshore Cyprus and Israel in the eastern Mediterranean. But all these alternatives are more expensive than Russian gas. Pause. Missing from this list is Iran. Iran has the world's second largest gas reserves, almost as much as Russia, or if you believe the published CIA figures, more than Russia. And Iran produces the gas for its internal market, which is big, 80 million people, and neighbors Iraq and Turkey. They plan one across as well to help me to Oman, I think. The United States is blocking Iran's plans for other pipelines west and east. And I'll talk about that, but putting Qatar into the context of the picture. And Qatar has the world's 3rd largest reserves. So you see, these are the big players. And Qatar is the world's largest exporter of LNG by tanker, and it wants to stay in that position. Iran and Qatar share the world's single largest gas reservoir. It's shown on the screen, and it straddles the Persian Gulf. It is enormous. A decade ago, Qatar and Iran had rival plans to build gas pipelines to Europe. Never been done before. It's difficult for all those countries to go through, and the economics and the costs, and the engineering. And the Qatar pipeline up the west side would pass, therefore, through Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Turkey. And the Turks like that idea, and then it would go on to Europe. From a Turkish point of view, it puts Turkey in the position of being a hub country for gas from different countries. And that was announced 10 years ago, 2009. Now, the Iran pipeline, the rival line, would pass on the east side of the Gulf, or the north, depending on the direction of your compass. It would go along Iran and then cut through Iraq into Syria, but not Turkey. And it was announced in May 2011, an ominous month. That's 2 months, that's 2 years after the Syrian plan. And Syria, after the Qatar plan, and Syria preferred the Iranian plan. So guess what? The United States, the Saudis, the Turks, and Qatar were not amused. I would just say this as a kind of en passant, that Syria itself also produces oil and gas, about as much, say, as Saskatchewan. And prior to 2011, it produced about 400,000 barrels a day. And much of that was for export, so not much by Middle East standards, but important for the economy. And then in August of 2011, the United States, Canada, and EU imposed sanctions on the export of oil from Syria, and also the import of economic inputs into Syrian refineries, which I guess means oil. But not the United Nations, so it's purely a Western initiative. And with that, Shell and the other operators had to move out, and production fell over a cliff. And then the fields were captured by Islamic State. Now, with help from Russia and Iran, the Syrian government, otherwise called the regime, has regained much of Syria, including the central gas fields. They center around Palmyra, that ancient Roman city. The battle now, of course, is for Idlib up in the northwest. And with help from the US military, the Kurds, who are in the northeast, have captured the eastern oil fields. And they're blocking that oil from reaching the western side of Syria, where most Syrians live. And Western sanctions are blocking oil imports by sea. So I say it's a nasty game, with oil rarely mentioned publicly, and again, hardly in our newspapers. You know, who knows about sanctions? Except Qatar's former Prime Minister, one of the Al-Thanis, the Prime Minister at the time, in 2011, recently spilled the beans. He said that Qatar and Saudi Arabia had been bankrolling Syrian jihadi from day one, working with the United States and Turkey. And Qatar basically supporting the folk up in the north, and Saudi Arabia bankrolling the folk in the south, with CIA operating offices in Turkey and in Jordan. Qatar spent, he said, $3 billion US in the first 3 years. It's not exactly chicken feed. You wonder what they're spending it on. Well, of course, the four countries want regime change, and they want to break up Syria. But they had no UN mandate, and they acted illegally. But in the ensuing war, of course, both pipeline schemes evaporated. One day they may come back. What about from Iran's point of view, east? Iran had long planned a gas pipeline east to Pakistan. And that too is blocked. The Iranian section is built, and the Pakistani section languishes. The thing being that the US threatens sanctions against Pakistan if it goes ahead. Washington, this is where I come to the end of my country survey. Washington has strongly backed a rival project since the 1990s, from Turkmenistan to Pakistan and India, through Afghanistan, through Kandahar. And it's called TAPI, after the initials of the four countries. Turkmenistan, which most people have never heard of, is just north of Afghanistan, and it has the world's fourth largest gas reserves. And it's sparked my interest when Canadian troops first went to Kandahar. Why was Afghanistan so important? Well, it may not have been about gas. It could have been about taking girls to school. I didn't know. 12 years ago, US Ambassador Richard Boucher, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Central and South Asia. He said, One of our goals is to stabilize Afghanistan to link South and Central Asia so that energy can flow to the south. The idea is to bind countries politically through physical infrastructure. And 4 years later, in 2011, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton went public in support of the TAPI pipeline. She was announcing it out in India, and she was touting it all up and down Texas, looking for US oil companies that might come in as a lead partner into the project. Well, I'm coming in for landing for the big picture, and to say, in summing up my views, that war and sanctions are both interventions. And while it's not all about petroleum, the petroleum connection is clear to see. I don't intend to string out the countries on the board, if you can see it at the back. If not, I can say them. But some countries have petroleum resources, and I've been talking about that: Iraq, Libya, Iran, Venezuela. Others have a strategic route for gas pipelines, and we think about them a lot less, or don't know about them. Like I saw the Syrian tale and the Ukrainian tale. And others border strategic sea routes. We've talked about them, but not much. The choke points in the introduction. Yemen, Somalia, and so forth. But all these countries are caught up in the biggest game of all. And it involves Russia and China, a challenge to US hegemony. And the US brings in other countries like Canada through NATO, Five Eyes. Since 9/11, Canada has sent troops overseas to Afghanistan, Iraq, Latvia, Libya, Mali, Ukraine. Canada is not at risk of imminent invasion, at least not the last time I knew. So who are our troops confronting, and why? We hear about Russia and so forth. To my mind, we see what you think, but I think these are fears drummed up for specific reasons. Rather like this idea, I sort of stare at those logs a bit. Perception and reality are quite different things, and all governments want to control their narrative. I guess maybe we all do in a way. We like to feel good and project ourselves well, but they want to set a policy agenda. And Washington sold the war on Iraq, for example, by alleging weapons of mass destruction. The reality was there were none, and they knew it. Our media echo our government's narratives, whatever they are. I think, I find the Globe and Mail quite good on a number of domestic issues, quite hopeless when it comes to how I see foreign affairs to be. They don't quibble on the government line. And generally, the petroleum story is out of sight. And the same points are repeated over and over and over again. It's a bit like George Orwell's 1984. But that doesn't turn the points into reality. Both Liberals and Tories, better be careful as an election's coming up, but both of them support US policies in the Middle East and elsewhere, not much to choose. And certainly not what is being presented with in the electioneering. But whether interventions and sanctions enhance democracy or human rights is highly questionable. For sure, sanctions benefit Canadians' oil exports. I gave this talk out in Edmonton 2 weeks ago. It's quite interesting. And sanctions on other oil exporting countries help knock out, remove competition. They increase oil prices. And that's not talked about openly either. So here's my last pretty picture. Petroleum power and politics, they all go together. They may only be part of the story. You'll have heard many others in other presentations, but they're worth discussing openly. So that's my talk. There's much more in the book, and I have a website, and the book's also available online at the publisher and in e-book if you like, or don't wish. But I particularly look forward to your questions and your comments and observations, because this is the part where I learn, and you really put me on the spot. So thank you very much.
you very much for your patience. I found it a very interesting talk, even a second time today. And I'd like to call upon Jerry Bonello to thank our speaker.
Good evening. I'm also with the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. When I first saw John several months ago, he gave a presentation actually that was not the same as this. It was much more focused on different countries. So I'm seeing here a much more comprehensive presentation, and I've told him that. He's shown that they are tremendously interlinked. Geopolitics and oil, and if you can't see it, I think it's almost irrefutable.
Yeah. Oh, on the back.
Okay. What this brings to mind to me, a way of framing this. Back in 1991, when, I'm sure most of you remember it, the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, I was in a demonstration in front of the U.S. consulate on the eve of the war. What was the chant that we started to hear? No blood for oil. It was the first time I heard that. That chant kept getting repeated over and over again. It became almost a refrain that was used in later wars because people were starting to see a connection, but nobody was actually writing about it. So that's where I thank John, because he's finally put it together, and it can only be done with somebody who has his level of expertise in this area, to show us how to connect the dots between the two. Now, I've read the book, Ken's read the book, I highly recommend it. It's a very easy read, and you'll get a lot more information than he was just presented here. Now, in light of all that, I would hope, after what you've heard what John said, that perhaps this is moving you to take action. That perhaps you might think that if the price of oil is blood, then maybe it's a little bit too expensive. So one suggestion, I'll invite you. We've got 2 positions available in the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. If you wish to consider taking further action, speak to Ken. Finally, just a reminder that you've seen the flyers. Our next talk is with Stephen Gowans, who's a blogger for What's Left. And that talk, the title of that talk is another book launch. It is Israel, Beachhead in the Middle East. Thank you, John.
We will start the Q&A very shortly, and but first I'm going to call upon Robert Allison to announce the Hamilton Palestine film series. Thank you.
You will have gotten a sheet like this. The title of the series is actually Hamilton Voices of Palestine. Last year we were trying to figure out a way of bringing Palestinian voices to Hamilton, and we started a film series that was met with some success last year, and this year we were able to expand it. We have the films on the second Tuesday of every month, usually in this hall. This year there is no admission at the door. I think during the film, so we'll probably pass around the hat because we do have expenses. But other than that, the list of films is there. We're going to be showing some very interesting commentary coming out of Palestine, unedited, or not covered in the Globe. Certainly not covered in the Globe. So please do come. And that's it. Thanks.
Robert at the back, by the way, is personing a table with Palestinian olive oil and za'atar, which are available for sale after the event. Another announcement is that refreshments have been kindly provided by Eileen, and during the Q&A, you are welcome to get up quietly and go over and help yourself to some tea and coffee and cookies and crackers, whatever you feel like, and just come back to your seat and we'll continue the Q&A. As for passing the hat, we are not doing it tonight. We traditionally do not pass the hat when we have a book sale and we want everyone to buy the book. However, if you are particularly well off after you've bought the book, which costs $25, we do have our hat sitting at the back table, our literature table, which is being personed by David Rennie. So please feel free on your way out to buy some olive oil and za'atar and take a look at the literature table and to throw some money into the big red hat. So we will begin the Q&A now, and there are some basic ground rules. The most basic ground rule is that you have 2 minutes tops to make a comment or a question, or a comment and a question. And we ask that there be no back and forth with John Foster afterwards. If he gives you an answer, that's it for tonight. Don't argue with him. Finally, we asked, following the church policy here, that there be no racist, sexist, or homophobic comments. Thank you for that. So we are going to go till about 9 o'clock with the Q&A. And John, why don't you come up here? And are there any questions or comments? Okay, Don.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm certainly going to get a copy of the book. Looking at all of this and the role that petrodollars play and petroleum plays in world politics,
Why don't we give you the microphone so that you can speak?
Looking at the situation where oil plays such an immense role and gas, what possible hope is there that we're going to get off fossil fuels and deal with the climate crisis?
Good question.
What a leading question. Because here, of course, I've been focusing on the conflicts and the immediate government machinations and games. Should I put that back in there for a moment? It doesn't matter very much. Am I okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, obviously, what you're talking of here, the getting off oil, is fundamental. It goes entirely into this issue of global warming. I mean, to put it in very simple terms, we hear from the Liberal Party that the achievement of the goals in the Paris climate change agreement and the expansion of the oil sands in Alberta are perfectly compatible. Well, for many studies I've read, and this is not my line of expertise, that's absolute rubbish. But, you know, this is what they say. How to transform an economy in such a way as to not use any more oil and gas than today, or indeed to go less, is obviously extremely difficult, and it's a question of whether a government wishes to do it, is determined to do it, thinks it can get re-elected if it will do it, and what the mood of the public is, and all the laws and all the regulations that go with that. I mean, I was thinking this morning we had a question about electric cars, and I've had other questions about hydrogen cars. Well, you know, this is part of the story. There's this and there's that, and there's all sorts of things that can be done with housing. But there are other things that go like what do you call it? The use of regulations of the use of gasoline in mileage or kilometre standards. Gosh, thank you. I've always wanted a glass of vodka that big.
It's gin, actually.
So, Yeah, it's very difficult. I personally don't see the full will there. I don't see it in any of the government platform. I mean, any of the political parties' platforms. The wish to do the kind of transformation that you're referring to. It requires public awareness and public push. Complete transformation of our cities.
Henry.
Yeah, John, we're all aware of what's happening in the Middle East with regards to Palestine and Syria. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the role that Israel plays in the oil cabal.
Yes. Well, one of it, there are several. One obvious one is the Golan Heights. We know that the Golan Heights, taken by Israel, command the heights over the lands below, and so from an Israeli point of view, it's part of their protecting their borders, no doubt. And water, the water up there. But what's interesting to me is that last year or so, discoveries of oil were made up in the Golan Heights on the Israeli-controlled side, big time, by an American oil company with interesting ownership. I would say interesting board of directors. Basically, the U.S. political good, great and the good. So it has American blessing. The Israeli press was extremely excited by this find. It's another reason, among many no doubt, as to why they would wish to hang on to the Golan Heights. So the second area to do with energy I could point to, and that is offshore, where gas has been found in the Israeli areas of the, as defined, of the Mediterranean, with the intent to bring that gas not only into Israel, which is a smallish market and is already satisfied, and down into Egypt likewise, but also to go further north through the Cypriot waters, connecting with Cypriot fields and into Greece. So the Greeks are pretty happy about this because they get transit fees off this. The European Commission supports it, and the US is really gunning for this. There are border disputes that go with that, which go with Lebanon, which go with Turkey, which of course has different views around Cyprus. So these could turn into shooting wars, not in the case of Lebanon, in the case perhaps of Turkey. That's about what I can think of right now on the gas. And I think the other aspect is, of course, is that Israel has teamed up with Saudi Arabia with such enormous reserves of oil that Saudi Arabia has, and against Iran, from whom, in the times of the Shah, that was the source of oil into Israel. Now, of course, from Israel's point of view, they've painted Iran as an enemy. I think of it more as a political challenge to Israeli hegemony that they would like to push regionally, and of course the United States. I think that's as far as I want to go.
Yeah, but with Hussein in Iraq and Gaddafi in Libya, if they had not sought to change from the petrodollar, would they have been attacked?
I think the reasons for war are multidimensional. It's like a game of multidimensional chess. And so I've been depicting the petroleum one. The financial one is extremely important to the United States. So much of its prosperity has relied upon finance. Whether, in what you say, whether there had not been this initiative to move towards the petrodollar, there might not have been war. I cannot answer, I have no idea. I just noticed the coincidence there. I do also note a little quote by Kissinger. I can't give it verbatim, but basically saying, you know, he who controls the oil controls the country out there worldwide, and he who controls the money controls the world, and he who controls, she's rather sexist, not under women, but he who controls the food controls everything.
Yeah, from the Iraq War. After the Iraq War, with the false allegation of mass destruction, the countries like US, UK and Australia, they voted again the Bush, Blair and John Howard. Only the country Spain did vote the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, who supported the war. So I'm surprised these countries, the Western world, North American, they call them civilized. How these civilized people supported the civilized activities, the war?
I don't know whether I would say that's a comment that stands on its own right, what you have said. Yes. By the way, on films, apropos, I just saw on Saturday night Official Secrets, all about how the war, from one point of view, was being engineered.
First, I want to ask, like, what you think this coalition could do to stop the war. Like, that's what they're about, right? And then my second one, I think, answers his about what would happen if all the other countries that produce the oil were to follow in not accepting the petrodollar to the global economy and the American and Canadian economy. And I think that'll answer his question.
Can you repeat that question for my benefit?
The first question was, what did you think that that coalition, like our coalition, our anti-war coalition, could actually do to stop war?
Yes.
And the second question was, what if all the other oil-producing countries stopped using the petrodollar, the US dollar?
Okay. Well, first, thanks to Ken for that too. What can the coalition do? That's not for me to say. That's up for you to air and discuss. But I have been asked before, in conversations after I've given this kind of a talk. We've had chats say at a lunch, and some people saying, "How depressing! What on earth can we do?" Well, I think there are things one can do. For example, with one's local member of parliament, or there's an election coming up. There are all candidates meetings. It's quite fun to be the first to make sure that one's sitting just like this, ready to grab the microphone and asking a question of the candidates, like what are you doing about? What are you thinking about? Who's going to buy the bitumen? Is my illustration. I've asked that of my local member of parliament, but we've got no answer for it.
What if the other countries?
What can the other? Would the other countries who export oil, say particularly in the Middle East, would they move off the petrodollar? Was that your question about like that?
What would happen to the global economy, and especially our
Well,
American
look,
economy, if they did? If they
yes.
no longer accepted, like Gaddafi was going to only accept
Fine.
gold, right?
Yeah.
If they only accepted gold, if they all followed suit.
I think Saudi Arabia would be very, very reluctant to move off the petrodollar. It was the first country to do this deal in 1973 or so with the United States to install that particular system, which benefited Saudi Arabia than the other countries that OPEC adopted it. In other words, the pricing of oil in the US dollar, and then the use of the US dollar as the means of exchange to buy it, which is then inflicted worldwide. If they moved off it, yes, then I'm not a monetary economist, said I carefully, but I could see what would you think? I could see a collapse in the US dollar. And certainly its ability to finance all this imperial warmongering.
I'll just take the liberty for 1 second to try and answer your first question. I think we have power when we act in unison. And if you recall, in the run-up to the war on Iraq in 2003, we had approximately 125,000 people in the street. I'm talking about the anti-war movement, to which we belonged at the time. And we had 125 people in 25,000 people in Toronto. We had approximately 100,000 in Ottawa, outside the Parliament, and we had about 250,000 in Montreal. And I think when Jean Chrétien looked out of his window in Parliament and he saw the entire Parliament Hill covered in people and spreading down all the side streets, I think that helped persuade him not to send troops, Canadian ground troops, into Iraq. I think that was a key factor. The other key factor was it didn't have the Anglo-American intervention in Iraq did not have the support of the UN Security Council. Those two things persuaded him not to send Canadian troops into Iraq. Of course, when everybody went home feeling good about that, the Canadian government, through NATO, sent ships and officers and all kinds of other support to the Americans in Iraq while we weren't looking. But it shows you what the power of mass movement can do. That's what we try and do. I think there was another question from Jim back there, then Gail, and then Jerry, and that'll probably be enough.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask.
Here you go.
Hi, there was a question earlier about what would happen if all the other oil nations suddenly all dropped the hegemonic US fiat currency. But, the hegemonic US fiat currency. But in recent week or so, there's been attempts to basically overcome the US Fed overnight rate, and they've been basically hammering it every night and like extorting like 120 whatever billion dollars a night now out of the US regime. So how long do you figure that the US currency might be able to hold on here?
I would take that as a helpful and useful observation. I don't have anything to add to it.
Gail.
So what would happen to the world economy if we actually get all the cars and trains and trucks on electricity, if we get our buildings on electricity and wind and solar, if we get all that, what's going to happen to the economy? Do you see, can we do that? What do you see the economy happening?
No, in a nutshell, is that what would happen to the Canadian economy?
No, the world.
What would happen to the world economy if we all moved off oil? Right?
We have to, so.
Yes, well, I think my granddaughters will find out. And we'll see how it can happen. I think it will be very difficult to persuade the general public of the need to shift in its driving habits, the way the cities are put together, going on using the train maybe, and so forth. But as I said, we'll see how it works out. My point is in giving this talk is that meanwhile with these weighty overhangs you're talking about, and all the global warming issues that loom over our head, the governments are focused on these geopolitical games. That's where the money's being made.
Jerry?
Yes, John, your presentation shows just how far-reaching oil is into geopolitics and the world economy. It's almost like an octopus with tentacles around the world. My question is about the fact that, my impression is anyway, that it's not just oil-producing nations and oil-exporting nations that are impacted by this, but as you showed, for example, in Afghanistan, you just have to be part of, a conduit. Even if you don't have oil.
That's right.
Right, you can be impacted. Can you give us any other examples where just being a neighbor, you get impacted by this?
I think the first point I'd make is that indeed to be a conduit country it does impact on you in all sorts of ways. We had the gas story in Europe, and some countries are winners and some are losers. For example, if Nord Stream 2 is built and Turk Stream 2 is built, Ukraine is a loser. And Ukraine gets, which provinces do not, gets transit revenues for the passing of the gas through its territory from one side to the other in the tune of about $2 billion a year. So it's not chicken feed. And other countries like Slovakia would also lose if that pipeline system were emptied. So the attempt is not to empty it, but basically to have a widening of alternatives. Other examples, well, I'm just always struck in the case of Canada that there's nothing in it in terms of money for the other economies, the other provinces. There's nothing in it for Ontario to have Energy East pass through it, for example.
All right, I still see some more hands.
Yep.
Did you want to say something?
No, I'll wait.
Okay. All right. Sure.
I can yell.
Okay.
Political science graduate from McMaster. I've been looking at this for ages, so I love that you put it all together in one spot. And I'm also watching the American election, and you talk about what's in it for countries. What's in it for the American people? Because you look at the Democrats and the Republicans, and they're pretty, Obama was just Bush too on foreign policy. What's in it for the American people? They've lost so much in taxes and in lives, and it seems there's maybe one candidate who's coming out against the foreign regime change wars of Gabbard, who's got no hope, even though she's my favorite candidate. What's in it for the American people to not, eventually stand up against this? Because most of them aren't benefiting that much.
Well, I think that's a statement too. I agree with you completely. But people don't know more than they can read in the newspaper or can read on their cell phones, in their laptops. As for researching, this kind of stuff I produce to you, it requires terrific digging. Who's willing to do that every day? You can get up at 4 in the morning and start.
Well, we're very glad that you have done that. We're very glad indeed. Robert?
North Korea, does it play any role, or is the one...
Any role for North Korea in the global petroleum scheme? Game?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? There's North Korea as a complete energy importer. My views on North Korea are that, well, I guess that comes back to Jerry's thought. It's interesting to me of how to come to a positive solution on this. And as you may know, the Chinese and the Russians have been posing the policy, pushing the idea of a double freeze. In other words, the North Koreans would freeze their nuclear weapons program, but in return, the United States would stop its exercises twice a year, threatening the overthrow of the North Korean government. Now, the other sweetener that Vladimir Putin has been pushing is the idea of making North Korea an energy bridge, so that South Korea could have a pipeline coming from Russia, from these fields in the Far East, Sakhalin Island, through North Korea and into South Korea. And from South Korea's point of view, a second one would be to have a rail link that would then extend up through North Korea and then go all the way across Siberia into Europe, so that South Korea can benefit in the same way that China is now benefiting by the movement of goods by rail all the way to Europe, which is much less than half the time of sending it by ship. That's what I can say right now that I can think of.
I think we're going to cut the question period here. If people want to talk to John at the table while buying a book, I think John would be glad to share his thoughts with you. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I want to remind you that the books are for sale for $25. The Coalition has a literature table at the back. The film series has the oil and za'atar. And please mark on your calendar October 28th for the book launch by Stephen Gallens. Thanks again for attending.